Hi there. This is Chapter 8, or Unit 8, and for this week, we're looking at other methods of primary research and really trying to get away from your typical sort of qualitative or quantitative type research where you're doing interviews or surveys or those sorts of things into a few other ways that you can actually conduct your research and get some very valuable information about your research subjects. So, to begin with, though, just wanted to lighten things up a little bit and show you this is a series of cartoons that came from a thing called The Far Side. So, if you've never seen The Far Side before, check them out. And this is their take on why dinosaurs became extinct. Anyways, so for today, looking at a few things, a couple of things in the news that popped up that I thought was kind of interesting. And then we're going to go through other types of primary research, all sorts of different things that ways that you can conduct your research and get information. And then we'll talk a little bit about at the end about meta-analyses and multiple methods. And we've actually briefly talked about that in the past when we talked about triangulation, but we'll just kind of recap some of that information as well. All right, a couple of things in the news. LiDAR. In case you haven't heard about LiDAR before, this is using lasers to do the sort of searching through. And you might have heard actually, if those of you that interested in phones and that, the iPhone 12 Pro and the Pro Max have LiDAR on them. I think some of the new iPad Pros also have the LiDAR on them. And it's using laser to get a sense of the environment and that sort of thing. Well, what they've been able to do with LiDAR is it will actually penetrate through forests and it reveals different things about these environments that they haven't been able to see before. And in this case, this is in the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico for this particular story, but Mexico, Guatemala, and Belize, Honduras, and El Salvador was the region for the Mayan Empire, Mayan civilization, and they've been discovering all sorts of different ruins. So using technology or new advances in technology to discover new things about the area. And I thought that was kind of an interesting way to discover new things and conduct new research. As well, a couple of stories. It's no surprise that the airlines have been one of the hardest hit parts of the travel industry. And this particular story showing that Japan Airlines, or JAL, largest ever annual loss with their international travel down 97%. So a lot of the airlines are finding it very tough right now, of course, and turning to governments, and there's been several lobbying efforts within Canada and around the world trying to get government money to just help them to survive. So it can really change the um, the landscape for the airline industry in the future, depending upon who makes it through with everything going on with COVID. The other story, Canada extending the cruise ship ban through February 2021. Now, realistically, that's not a big deal since there's very few, if any, cruise ships that go through Canada in the wintertime, of course. So really what they're saying is next summer, we'll take a look at things again. And so hopefully by then, some processes will be figured out And really, there'll be an opportunity for the cruise ship industry in Canada to watch what happens in the Caribbean over the winter and see how that's handled. So, kind of fingers crossed that that part of the industry and others kind of make it through. This week, a couple of discussion questions. What are some innovative ways, techniques, methods, etc., to conduct and/or combine research, and how might you do that? So, thinking about how can you get creative with conducting your research. And secondly, experiments are rarely used in tourism research. Why do you think this is? And what are some areas that you think experiments might be useful? And we're actually going to be talking today about experiments and how experiments can be used in research. And I'll give you an example that I used myself for when I conducted my doctoral research. Okay. Other methods of primary research, other ways of knowing. And as I mentioned before, um, you've got all of your typical ways of conducting research, things like surveys and focus groups and interviews, but there's a lot of other ways that you can gather that information. And again, if you think back to, I think probably unit 2 or 3, somewhere in there, when we were talking about the who, what, why, where, when of research, and then leaving the how, so how you're going to conduct the research towards the end. And this is where, once you've figured out kind of what you're trying to get at and who might be the best sources for that information and when you might want to conduct the research, you may discover that the how of carrying out your research actually doesn't involve any direct contact with people whatsoever. So, or in connecting with people in a much different way than you might have thought in the past. So, that's kind of, we'll talk about observation research. And it's really, kind of on its face, it's watching what people are doing, trying to be very objective as you're recording things, knowing what you're looking for, interpreting how, what you're watching, things like that. And it can really give you a lot of good information that can help you answer your research questions. So that's why observation research can be a very powerful tool when you're conducting research. I'm not going to click on this YouTube video. You can check it out whether you go through this link here or if you go through the PDF slides, you should be able to click on the link or at least enter that YouTube. And this is shows you a little bit about some marketing research that was conducted at a McDonald's, but not actually by McDonald's. This was a research project done by some students at a McDonald's. So something for you to check out and just see how observation is actually done when you're conducting research and how you might be able to incorporate this sort of thing into research in the future. Quite often, if you remember back when we were talking about different types of research, we talked about exploratory research and confirmatory research, things like that. Well, quite often you'll use observation research in the exploration stage of research, where you're not really sure what's important, and by observing, that can sometimes give you that just base level of understanding of what's going on and what are the key factors, what are the things that you need to ask about, pay attention to, things like that. And generally very unstructured. So, because the first times you start observing things, you may not know exactly what to watch for. So that's why you have to kind of just work things out and adapt as you go along through the research. They can be very valuable. Um, and the interesting thing about them is that when you're watching some people and how they naturally behave, you can gather a lot of information, even if the people don't realize um, what they're doing when they're doing it. I give you the example there, and a lot of stores realize this, and I'm sure most of you should know this. If you don't, this might be kind of interesting for you, that the more valuable things for the stores, they put at your eye level. Things that they make less money on, they put either above your eye level or below your eye level, knowing that most people will purchase things at that first level of eyesight. A couple of things you really want to think about when you're conducting observation research. And first is, how much structure or formality can you actually do when you're preparing to do your observation research? And that may be based on, has anyone else done any research similar? How much do you already know about the situation before you go into it? If you don't know a whole lot, your pre-structure or your formality will be very minimal. The more you know, the more you can go in with at least a base level of understanding about what to watch for, what to record, things like that. Second part to think about when you're doing observation research is how much you, as the researcher, are a part of the whole situation. Whether you are completely an outsider and observing, and you may not even be physically in the location that you're observing. You know, you might be watching a video, pictures, things like that, or other methods, or you might be right on a part of the whole group. And so it's something we'll talk about in just a few moments, something called participant research. So you have to gauge your role in the whole process and how much of an impact you might have on the way that the people are going to act if they know that you're there or not. So just some things to think about. This link here is something for you to try out. And it's a kind of a video test of your observations just to see how observant you are. Um, give it a try. It's actually kind of a neat little video to watch and to try to pay attention and just see what you get out of it. When you're thinking about observation research, um, there's several positives, several pros of conducting observation research. First off, very direct, very immediate, as you're watching people, watching how they react, you're recording everything, things like that. There's hopefully little time lag and you're gathering a lot of information. It does not require recall, especially, and we're talking about the participant. So, there might be times if you were doing an interview or a survey or something like that, and you may ask somebody, how much time did you spend reading that sign? Or how much time did you spend standing in line? How many people did you go to the game with? And Unfortunately, people's memories are not that great at times. So if you're using observation research, you know exactly what happened, when it happened, how it happened, and you don't need that person to remember everything that they did. So that's where it can be very powerful. It can provide good complementary information. And for this unit, I believe there's some examples there, um, but I can give you a very quick example. In Fort Langley, in the lower mainland around Vancouver, there is a National Historic Site called Fort Langley. And so I did some research there where we did some observation research where we actually tracked um, people going around this National Historic Site. And it's an old fort with several buildings inside and several exhibits and things like that. So we had people watch as somebody came up to the site. We started the timer, we checked how long they spent at the site, how long they spent at each one of the exhibits, in the different buildings, things like that. And then we actually interviewed them afterwards. Uh, we didn't tell them that we had been tracking them, and we were able to actually combine that information from the tracking and the interview to gather some very powerful information that told us things like um, people didn't have any specific route, and those that did not have that had the least specific routes around the site had the least understanding of the significance of the site. So, which led to us creating maps that had suggested routes and things like that with some of the key information on the map so that people would get a much better understanding of the historical significance of the site. So that's where interviews and observation came together and were very powerful. When you conduct it in the field, no artificiality is introduced. So by that, we mean that if you're actually observing how somebody's behaving in on site out in the field, then you're not having to try to recreate something in a lab. You're not having to recreate something in a building or anything like that. You're able to actually watch people in the natural situation behaving as they naturally would. So it's just that much more real and that much more powerful. And if you do it discreetly, if they don't know that you're there, then people act more naturally and there's less concern about them behaving in a socially acceptable way. For example, making sure that they throw all their garbage into the garbage can, or making sure that they stay on the path, or things like that. Whereas if you were to ask them afterwards, they might not reveal that they had done things that would be considered socially unacceptable. So that's where observation can be very powerful. Some of the issues, though, is that it's not easy. Um, there is a lot of work to doing it. The while you can understand, or you might be able to see what they're doing, without doing an interview or anything like that afterwards, you don't always know why they uh, left the path, why they went beyond the barrier, why they did not stop and read the signage, things like that. All you see is what they did, not why. Um, there can be ethical issues if you haven't set up the study so that the people can be either informed or there being some sort of way to let them know that you're doing the research. But you also have to be careful that you don't want them to behave in an artificial or socially acceptable manner if you directly do inform them. So it's a very tight, a very fine balance there about how much you give them and how you do that. It can be very time consuming. In that example that I gave you at Fort Langley, for every single person that we were tracking, that was 45 minutes of time. So if you can think about your typical day, uh, thinking about breaks and things like that, at most, we were able to get 8 complete observations in a day. So number-wise, not a whole lot of people because you're having to track every single person, how much time they're spending, things like that. And to be really good at that observing and recording can take a bit of work, a bit of time, skill, things like that. So again, um, it's not necessarily an easy thing to do, but it can be a very powerful, useful thing. Here's another YouTube video for you to watch to check out how technology is helping to, I guess, augment that sort of that observation research, things like that, and gather more valuable information. Now, here's what we mentioned a few moments ago about participant observation, and where you're directly a part of the group that you're actually observing. So it's just kind of a more extreme type of observation research. And this particular type of research takes even more skill to make sure that the observations are not biased, that the participant, you as the researcher, the participant, are not creating issues, not affecting the natural behaviors that people are going to do. You have to actually tell the people right from the start that you're going to be observing them for research. And because you are telling them that you're conducting this research, it's possible that they will change their behavior. So it's something that you need to really think about before you do it. The plus side, or the positive side of it, though, is that by being a part of the group, by exposing yourself to the exact same things that the rest of the group are being exposed to, you can sometimes come away with much greater insight and a much better understanding of why people are behaving the way that they are. So essentially what happens is, for example, a tour group. You join the tour group, you go on the tour with the tour group, you do all the same things as the tour group does, you listen to all the messages that they're getting. They're all aware that you're doing this research, but the interesting or funny thing is that after you've been with the group for a while, especially if it's more than just a quick one-off, if you're there maybe for several days or longer, weeks or even months, um, they can actually start to forget that you're doing that research. And you become a part of the group, you get brought into the group, and you become much more a part of the whole situation. So, and that's when their behaviors start to become even more and more natural in the way that they would have been. Trouble is, the longer that you're with the group, the greater the concern could be that you're going to have a biased perception. You start to identify with this group that you're a part of, that you're conducting the research with, you're being, doing all the same things that they are, and suddenly you're starting to justify what they're doing and their behaviors based on because you're now a part of the group and you're viewing things through their eyes. So there is that danger and that concern, um, almost like, um, well, other than the fact that they would not know, but becoming a part of a particular group and conducting research on that group, and then having to be very objective in how you are critical of the group and their behaviors. So it is not necessarily an easy process to do. This is just kind of a list of some of the things that you might record in your observations. So whether it be physical setting, who's involved, the types of people, about them, things like that, what they're doing, what's happening around the situation, maybe, noteworthy events, things like that, even the series of events or what happens first, second, third, in the sort of sequence, why people are doing. And you may even, depending upon how long you're with the group and how in tune you are with them, even collecting some of their feelings, their perceptions, things like that. Now, I'll show you a series of 4 images in just a moment. And if thinking about all these sorts of ways you can describe situations or people and things like that, what you're going to see is a series of 4 markets. But that's almost where the similarities end. These are completely different markets, different places in the world. And if you were describing them, your descriptions of them would probably be very different, with maybe threads of similarities, the fact that they are all markets. Take a look at this first market, and I don't know if, the image of this market rings true. Anyone can actually identify the particular market. I'll give you just a moment to think about it. But you think back to that list that we were just looking at and just think to yourself, what sorts of things, if you were trying to describe this particular image to somebody else, how you might describe it. What are the things that would stand out? What would you record? What would you say about all the things, all the people, all the objects, the different activities, things like that? This particular market is in Guatemala, a place called Sololá in Guatemala. And a very traditional market with all the traditional colors and clothing and everything like that. Contrast this with this image here. So again, using your powers of observation, looking over the image, the types of people, what's being sold, everything like that. Even a bit of the image around, a bit of the scenery around the image. And you think for a moment where this might be. This particular market is in Nairobi, Kenya. So in their capital city of Nairobi, again, a street market. So very different images, different things being sold, probably very different activities that you would be observing if you were actually there. Next one. This might be a little bit more familiar to some people, especially if you look very closely at some of the signage, things like that, how things are written, some of the the words. Obviously, this is a fish market, at least this part of it, talking about different types of salmon, looks like crabs, things like that. This market is Pike's Market in Seattle, Washington, so just a little ways south of us here in Victoria. And this is very typical of Pike's Market. So, and finally, this image here. So looking over it, some of the words, some of the images, some of the things that are being sold, the way people are dressed, things like that. And this might fool some people just based on what you're seeing here. This particular market is Granville Island Market in Vancouver. So now, of course, all of these images that you were just seeing pre-COVID. So now they're probably all very different, although not necessarily, but what you're seeing there. And again, which brings up an important point, research in itself is very time bound. So that's why whenever you're conducting research or reading about research, things like that, the context of the situation and when that research was conducted can be very important to interpreting the information and understanding the information gathered, not just for observation research, but for any types of research. So understanding the context is very important to understanding. Some of the things you need to watch out for with observation research, some of the biases that can occur. First off, selective attention. If you haven't done observation research before, you have to be careful that you don't pay too much attention on some things and not enough attention on other things. It's very easy to be distracted and to focus your attention, to lock in on certain aspects of your observations and forget all sorts of other things that are also occurring at the same time that might be as important or even more important when you're doing your observation research. Here's a short video to just give you an example of how selective attention can affect your observations. Selective encoding. It's very easy for us, and another way of thinking about selective encoding is stereotyping. So selective encoding, you see a particular behavior, you immediately chalk it up, or you immediately categorize it as meaning a certain thing. And that may not be true. Again, as I said previously, with observation research, you can understand what is happening, but not necessarily the why. So that's why for a lot of observation research, you have to be very careful about categorizing things and about attributing certain behaviors to certain feelings or certain things without truly understanding the situation. Selective memory. The longer you wait between the observations and the recording of the observations, the more likely you are to forget things. And that's why if you're doing any observation research, try to record everything as quickly or as soon after that observation as possible. And interpersonal factors. Again, sometimes if you are starting to get to know the people or the group that you're observing and you start to empathize with them, you can, um, unfortunately start to uh, either miss things or not record things objectively or not understand what's going on. So you have to be very careful to try to stay as objective as possible when you're conducting the research. Lots of different ways to record the information. Again, because some of it's exploratory, you have to be open to, how you're going to be doing the recording. But again, you still need to have some sort of system, some sort of way to code, to write down, uh, to manage everything you're going to be watching or seeing. One of three overriding things that you can, ways that you can set up how you're going to code. One is called event coding. And event coding is when a certain event occurs, you record it or how many times that event has occurred. It may be important to understand the whole sequence, A, then B, then C, kind of like when I was talking about tracking somebody around Fort Langley and understanding that which building they went to first, second, third, what was the exact routing around the site. So you're observing when you're recording all these different activities, really thinking about not only that activity occurred, but what order and when. The state coding. A state coding is when you're looking for a particular condition to occur, and when that condition does occur, you record that and all the things about it. So this particular example, how often does it happen that there are 5 people or more in the lineup? And how long do they have to wait? Things like that. You might be looking for kind of particular outliers. How, what was, um, when somebody threw garbage onto the ground, why did they throw it on the ground? Was it only at certain situations, certain times of the day? Was it maybe only when the garbage can was full? Again, what are the conditions that caused or that were around a certain situation that you observed? And then there's interval coding, where you might just divide your day up into, say, 20-minute blocks or half-hour blocks and record everything that happens during that certain time period. So these are all different things you can do to record these behaviors. Now, a very quick example of how observation can be very valuable and give you a lot of really good information that you don't necessarily expect to find. Years ago, when I was working with Parks Canada, we were trying to evaluate the effectiveness of a brochure and it was a brochure about animals and wildlife and how to behave around animals. The actual brochure was called Keep the Wild in Wildlife. So those of you that might have been to the mountain parks in like Banff, Jasper, Lake Louise, those sorts of places, you might have gotten the brochure called Keep the Wild in Wildlife. Well, we were testing out how we could make it more effective. There was a bunch of incidences that were occurring. So what we did was we actually got a bunch of people into a focus group around a table, but to somewhat simulate how people would be getting all of their brochures, what we did was we handed them the stack of brochures that they would receive when they arrived at the park. So they would get this Keep the Wild Wildlife, they would get a brochure about all the hotels in town, they'd get a couple of other things, and we gave them that stack and said, this is the brochures that you receive when you drive up to the park. And then we just watched how they behaved. And one thing that we quickly noticed after the first couple of groups was that no one ever grabbed that Keep the Wild and Wildlife brochure first. It was always everything else, and then eventually, after they had looked through the other brochures, then they would get to Keep the Wild and Wildlife and start thumbing through it. And unfortunately, it made us realize right there that we were missing the target, that we were first off giving them way too much information, and that brochure was not standing out and attractive enough to make them pay attention to it. So this led to a completely revamped brochure that had a lot more information and a bunch of other things that we changed in it so that we could improve the effectiveness of the brochure and the likelihood that people would look at it. So that's where observation and watching people how they behave was very valuable in the research that we were conducting. Experimentation. You've probably all heard of experimentation. Experimenting, if you get into pure science, experimentation and true experimentation can be a lot of work. You have to think about things like having control groups and things like that. So, and in general, experimentation is not something that you would be regularly seeing, especially not in tourism and hospitality research. But you can do minor experimentation and gather some really important information. Give you an example there, yeah, right at the bottom. And something that I used to do when I managed a store at a summer resort was we would move things around into various locations in the store just to see where they would sell the best, how we wanted to move, what we wanted to sell next to something else. And then we'd keep track of the best locations and the best combinations of products to maximize sales within a store. So that's where you can actually experiment on a very minor sort of basis. And as long as you're doing it with purpose and keeping track of that sort of thing, again, it can be very valuable for your organization. Same sort of thing, you may try it with a website and try different wording and experiment and see how it occurs. Different colors, all sorts of different ways you can experiment, test things out, and then after you've tried them out, you discover what's the most effective way to accomplish what you're trying to do. Photo studies. Photo studies are again, a very different sort of way to conduct research. And the use of pictures as a way to gather information can be really useful and give you a lot of really valuable information. Here's just a couple of examples of how pictures and photography can be used within research. First off, something called respondent photography. And that's where, if you're doing it purposefully, overtly, as a part of your research, what you can do, and we've done at a National Historic Site before, is you actually ask people to go out and enjoy the site, enjoy whatever you're trying to do. And while they're there, while they're doing, enjoying their visit or whatever the case may be, and taking pictures, you ask that whenever they take a picture, they record why they took that picture. So when they're done, they give you back, copies of all the pictures, along with their explanations of why they took the pictures. And it can be an interesting way to really discover how people are experiencing a site. When we did this at a National Historic Site, and we had people take pictures and tell us why they were taking those pictures, it was interesting to see where people might, 5 or 6 or more people taking pictures of the exact same thing, but their reasoning being completely different. For example, taking a picture of a house, and one person says, we're repainting our house, and that's the exact color we want our house to be. Another person says, well, I took the picture because it reminds me of my childhood home. And somebody else might say, I took the picture because, that's the sort of house that I want to build. So, 3 exact pictures, 3 completely different reasons for taking that picture. Nowadays, with social media, things like Instagram and even Facebook and other things, where people write little descriptors underneath their photographs, you can actually gather a lot of information about why people took pictures, just freely available on the internet. So again, it can be very valuable. Another way that you can use pictures is through something called a photo sort. And this is where you will bring a group of people in, or you could do this individually, but sometimes much nicer to do it in a group. And you have a bunch of pictures laid out on a table, laid out somewhere. You could do this electronically as well. But you ask them a series of questions, and you get them to choose pictures that answer those questions. So for example, we used that when we were doing research about Canada and perceptions of Canada. So we would go to various countries, bring a whole series of pictures from Canada, and say, ask the participants to the focus group, choose 3 pictures that make you think about Canada and tell us why you chose those particular pictures. And by doing that, we started to understand how people saw Canada, what things stood out, why they liked Canada or why they didn't like Canada, why they wanted to visit now or why they didn't think that they needed to visit until sometime in the distant future. So again, gave us a lot of very valuable information that shaped the marketing plans. And it's one of the reasons why, if you take a look at any of the research or any of the images now for Canada, from Destination Canada, they always have a person kind of in the front or in the foreground doing some sort of activity, and then key things in the background, whether it be city, nature, whatever the case may be, but all those sorts of landscape part is in the background of the picture. And that was a huge change for Destination Canada or uh, the Canadian Tourism Commission, because we used to do these beautiful broad vistas, showing Canada's lakes and rivers and fields and things like that, and just gorgeous shots, but there was never anybody in those pictures. And because of those photo sorts that we were doing, we found out that people loved the image, but they would tell us that they had no idea what they would do there. We weren't telling them how they could enjoy Canada. So they would look at it, go, yeah, that's beautiful, but I would be scared there, I would be bored there, I would get lost there. They had no idea how to enjoy Canada from those big landscape pictures that we were showing them. So we had to completely revamp everything that we did based on that research. So you might see pictures like these. Believe it or not, these are Christmas images. But these are Christmas images for the Gold Coast of Australia, and a much different perception of what Christmas means to people in Australia. Christmas to Australians is, lying on a beach, Santa Claus surfing, things like that. But until you talk to them, until you show the images, it's a totally different perception. Another type of research, case studies. And case studies are where you go very detailed um, on a very specific situation, person, phenomenon, something like that. So, a few different levels of case studies. Might be an individual case study, for example, a detailed account of a single person. You've probably read that sort of thing before, where almost like a biography of a particular person or a particular situation, and goes very in depth to understand as much as you can about that situation. Quite often, again, these sort of things are exploratory because you're trying to record every single thing, because you don't know what's important. You don't know what are the things that are worthwhile paying attention to. So you record everything. And you let people afterwards, and once you get a few of these sort of case studies, maybe somebody else starts to see a bit of a trend or starts to better understand what are the important things that you need to pay attention to, and what are the things that are just happenstance, just part of the situation. You can have a set of individual case studies, small group of subjects with some commonalities. When I did my master's thesis research, I did case studies on two ecotourism companies that were operating from the United States and Canada, but they were operating in Central America. So I did very detailed analyses of these two companies. Everything, human resources, finance, their marketing, their customers, where they went, how they did it, everything. I even went on the tours with those two companies to understand from their perspective, and talking to their customers, what that experience was all about. So, or the case study may be an organization or institution, or a series of organizations or institutions. So the nice thing is you get very detailed understanding of that particular organization, individual, phenomenon, but they are a lot of work and you cannot do a whole bunch of them, or at least not very quickly. So case studies are a lot of work, but they can gather some very valuable, detailed information about the situation. When I was looking at the eco tour companies, I was trying to find out whether or not eco tour companies, and this is back in 1993, 94, whether or not eco tour companies, if they followed pure eco tour guidelines, what did that mean to their operations? And I discovered that they could do that, but they probably would not make a lot of money. And that it was more of a conscious choice than a way to become rich when they were these pure eco tour companies. So that's what was interesting about that. A few other ways of conducting primary research, again, very kind of out of the box ways of conducting the research. Things like unobtrusive measures. So you might take a look at the wear patterns on the floor of your business to see the routes that people tend to take. You may see where people are dropping their garbage and see if it's a common place that people drop their garbage, or a common type of garbage that's getting dropped, or a certain time of the week, or things like that. But just observing where that garbage is being dropped, how often the garbage needs to be emptied. Third one there, kind of an interesting bit of research, observation, unobtrusive research. There was a company that was working with a rental car agency to find out what was the radio station, and this is back again before people were more often using their own, Spotify or other things like that to listen to music, but actually listening to radios and finding out what were the radio stations that people were leaving their cars when they returned their rental car. What were they listening to? And they took that information and went to the radio stations and went, hey, I know which radio stations all of these tourists are listening to. These are the radio stations you need to advertise with the any of the tourism and hospitality companies or any other services at a destination. So it was very valuable information that told all of these tourism and hospitality companies, we now know what are the most popular radio stations to advertise with. Another university, when they built a brand new area at their university, they did not put any paths in. So there was no sidewalks or nothing in this one particular area. And all they did was they let people create their own paths initially. So let them walk however they were going to walk. And then once they had kind of established these routes that people were going to take between the buildings, then that's where they built the walkways, the sidewalks, and things like that. So again, rather than trying to artificially understand how people were going to move through the space, they let the people decide, and then they worked with them. So you can be very creative in how you gather the information. Content analyses. Quite often it's audio, video, print, things like that. And what you're doing is you're either listening to the information, you're watching, you're reading the stuff, and you're trying to pick out some of the what are the key words that are being used. Is the language generally positive or negative? Um, how are they describing something? As a very quick example of that, um, we've used content analyses in the past by looking through different tour guides and things like that, destination guides, and we would read through how they were describing Canada. So, were they talking about Canada positively or negatively? What were they highlighting as the key things to see in Canada? That sort of thing. And that gave us a lot of really good information um, about what sort of marketing we needed to do, what sort of images we had to use or stop using, things like that. Possibly people were misunderstanding and getting wrong perceptions. So that's where, by reading through or listening to people or seeing how people describe a situation, how they talk about something, you can better understand other people's perceptions of you and your situation. Now, as I make note there, um, depending upon how much information you're gathering together, it can be a lot of information. And there's a few electronic tools to help you with the compiling of information and gathering of information, but it's still pretty crude, very basic at this stage. And the other issue, it's getting a bit better with artificial intelligence, but generally, any of those sort of computer assisted ways of analyzing the information, which we'll actually talk about, I think next week and the week after, when we start talking about analyses, is quite often electronic measures do not get subtleties. They don't get quite understand sarcasm. They don't understand necessarily context of the language. So that's where the human interpretation is so important. Verbal protocols. Verbal protocols can be you have somebody talk through what they're doing, why they're doing it, while they are doing it. So, give an example there. Somebody planning a trip, and you actually have them describe what they're doing while they're planning that trip or while they're using your website. We've done this before where we would recruit people to come use a website and ask them to, try it out. And while they're trying it out, they're telling us exactly what they're doing, why they're doing it, where they're going on that website, what they're looking for, what they're trying to click on, why they're clicking on certain areas. And by getting them to describe what they're doing and why they're doing what they're doing, you get to better understand, again, things from that user's perspective, so that your user interface or your UI is giving you the results, is getting that experience that you were trying to get them. So these sort of verbal protocols, again, kind of allow you to get into the heads of your visitors, heads of your customers, and see things through their eyes. Now, a meta-analysis is a special type of primary research that, in some respects, doesn't actually involve going to people. What you're actually doing is you're taking several different studies of a similar situation, similar condition, similar problem, and you combine them all together into one big study to better understand the situation. So maybe you're interested in wine tourism, and you've had several people, take a look at wine tourism from several different regions. Maybe some people did it down in the Napa Valley, and some people in the Okanagan, and believe it or not, some people here on Vancouver Island, and maybe even some down in Australia or New Zealand. But they're all individual studies. As a researcher, what you can do sometimes is take all of these individual studies, pull them all together, and start to look for those sort of patterns, some similarities, some things that were occurring in all of the different studies that start to give you a little bit better understanding of the problem that you're looking at. And the reason why you might do that is because possibly the sample wasn't big enough, or um, maybe it didn't happen often enough, or maybe the researcher just discounted something that occurred as being not worthwhile. It doesn't really matter. But when you start combining all these different studies together, you may start to notice that the same thing is occurring within all of these different research studies, but no one is bothering to notice it, no one is bothering to pay attention to it. And that's where a meta-analysis can be very valuable. But it does take, first you need to have several studies already having taken place, and where you have access to all those previous studies. Finally, last thing we're going to talk about, multiple methods. And we've talked about it once before, mentioning about triangulation. And that's where you approach a problem and you look at it from multiple angles. You use a few different methods, and you bring these different methods together, looking at the same problem. And by looking at that same problem from different perspectives, different views, different methods, hopefully you better understand what that problem is from that combination of the various methods. So by looking at it from different points of view, you bring it all together, and you can better understand what your problem is all about. And in some respects, the different methods that you use are kind of like checks and balances, or they're a way of verifying that what you found through the survey and through the interview actually came up with very similar responses. And so while you were maybe kind of sure when you did the interview, you became really sure after the survey because they both told you the same thing. So that's why you might use multiple methods to conduct your research. Um, really, triangulation is something that we often will strive for if we're trying to really truly understand a problem. It's something that does not occur all the time, and it doesn't occur a lot of the time, but it's something that we do try to achieve, um, to to make sure that our research is valid and useful. So that's it for today. That's it for this unit. Again, if you have any questions, just ask. Please go ahead, just ask. If you have any ideas or want to know a little bit more about any of these various methods, I've got tons of stories that I could tell you. So just let me know. And again, this was around Christmas time in on the Gold Coast at one of the theme parks there. So, all right, have a good one and take care.